The scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air, mingling with the distant hum of the city beyond the window. The morning light filtered through half-open blinds, cutting lines of gold across the wooden floor. A spoon clinked against porcelain, steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Martin sat at the small, round table in their kitchen, his fingers absently tracing the rim of his mug. Across from him, Daniel flipped through his phone, his other hand casually resting around his own cup. They had done this dance for years. Mornings shared in quiet comfort, the kind that only came with familiarity. "Big day?" Daniel asked without looking up. Martin hesitated. The question was harmless, routine, but today, the weight of it pressed against his chest. "Not really," he answered, taking a sip of his coffee. "Just the usual." Daniel finally glanced up, his dark eyes searching. There was something about the way he looked at Martin, like he could peel back layers without trying. It had always made Martin feel seen, understood. Now it made him feel exposed. The sharp chime of a phone vibrated against the table. A message. Martin flinched before he could stop himself. Daniel noticed. "Aren't you going to check that?" Martin forced a chuckle, shaking his head. Probably just work. He didn't reach for the phone. He didn't need to. He already knew who it was from. Martin could still feel the heat of last night's conversation. The way Roland's voice had dropped, low and intimate. The way his words had lingered long after they had said goodbye. "I think about you too much." "You should stop." "Do you want me to?" Martin had never answered, but he hadn't told him no, either. Well, Daniel sighed, stretching his arms above his head before standing. "I should get going. Staff meeting first thing." He moved behind Martin's chair, his hands settling on his shoulders for a brief, familiar squeeze. "Don't work too hard, okay?" Martin nodded, offering a small, tight-lipped smile. "You too." The front door shut a moment later, leaving behind silence. Martin exhaled slowly. He reached for his phone. "Are you free tonight?" His fingers hovered over the screen. Then, almost without thinking, he typed, "Yes." The office was a blur of conversations, the hum of printers, the occasional ring of a phone. But none of it registered. Not really. Rolan leaned against Martin's desk, his expression unreadable. "You hesitated this morning," Rolan said, his voice low. Martin glanced up sharply. "What?" "When I texted you," Rolan continued, studying him. "You didn't answer right away." Martin swallowed. "I was with Daniel." A slow smirk tugged at the corner of Roland's lips. "And now you're with me." Martin hated how easily those words sent a thrill through him. Hated how much he had begun to crave the rush of it all. Roland didn't ask for permission. He never did. He reached down, fingers brushing against Martin's wrist, just a fleeting touch, barely there. But it sent a spark up Martin's spine, something electric and dangerous. "Tonight," Roland murmured. Martin should have said no. He didn't. By the time he got home, Daniel was already waiting. "Hey!" Daniel greeted, setting his book aside. "You're late." Martin forced a smile. "Yeah, got caught up in some last-minute reports." A pause. Daniel didn't speak right away, but Martin could feel it, the weight of unspoken words pressing into the space between them. "Everything okay?" Daniel finally asked. Martin's breath hitched. For a moment, he almost said it, almost let the truth tumble out. "No, it's not okay. I'm slipping away from you, and I don't know how to stop." But instead, he smiled. A perfect, practiced smile. "Of course," he lied. Daniel watched him a moment longer, then nodded. "Okay." He believed him. Or maybe he just wanted to. Martin turned away before Daniel could see the guilt flicker across his face. Outside, his phone buzzed. A single message. "I can't wait to see you." Martin clenched his jaw, staring at the screen for a long time. Then, slowly, he typed back, "Me too." The morning felt different. Daniel was right there, across the table, his fingers wrapped around a steaming mug, his eyes flicking between the newspaper and Martin. But something had shifted. The air between them felt heavier, stretched thin with an unspoken tension. Martin stirred his coffee, watching the way the liquid swirled in slow, deliberate circles. He could feel Daniel studying him, his gaze lingering just a second too long. "You barely touched your breakfast," Daniel finally said, voice calm but observant. Martin forced a small smile. "Not that hungry." Daniel nodded, but his fingers drummed lightly against the table. An old habit of his. Something he did when he was thinking. Or worrying. "I was thinking," Daniel said, setting his mug down. "We should take a weekend away. Just us." Martin's grip on his spoon tightened. "Somewhere quiet. Maybe the cabin," Daniel continued, his tone easy, almost hopeful. "No work. No distractions. Just time together." Martin swallowed hard. A weekend away. With Daniel. His mind flickered back to last night. The way Rolan had pressed him against the hotel room door, breath hot against his neck. The way his voice had curled with possession when he whispered, "You don't belong to him when you're with me." Martin forced down the memory. He nodded quickly, too quickly. "Yeah, that sounds nice." Daniel smiled. It should have made Martin feel safe. Instead, it made his stomach churn. The office was colder than usual, or maybe it was just Martin. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the mechanical sound of keyboards clattering filling the space. Rolan was already waiting, leaning against the doorway to Martin's office, arms crossed, looking entirely too amused. "You're late," he murmured, low enough that only Martin could hear. Martin brushed past him, his jaw set. "I had breakfast with Daniel." How domestic. Rolan shut the door behind them. "Did you tell him where you were last night?" Martin turned sharply, eyes flashing. "Do you want me to?" Rolan's smirk deepened. Would it make a difference? A tense silence settled between them. Martin exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. He hated how easily Rolan got under his skin, how the very presence of him sent his pulse hammering. Rolan stepped closer, close enough that Martin could feel the warmth radiating from him. "You don't regret it," Rolan whispered, voice smooth, knowing. Martin wanted to tell him he was wrong, that this was a mistake, that the guilt of it was eating him alive. But Rolan was right, and that scared him more than anything. That night, Martin arrived home later than usual. Daniel was in the kitchen, washing dishes, sleeves rolled up, the muscles in his forearms flexing with each movement. It was such a simple sight, one Martin had seen 100 times before. But tonight, it made his chest tighten with something dangerously close to regret. "You missed dinner," Daniel said without turning around. Martin set his bag down carefully, like the sound of it might shatter the fragile quiet between them. "I got caught up at work." Daniel finally looked over his shoulder, eyes scanning Martin's face. "You sure about that?" The word sent a jolt through Martin, sharp and sudden. He forced a laugh. "What's that supposed to mean?" Daniel turned off the faucet, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Nothing." But it wasn't nothing. It was suspicion. Martin knew Daniel, knew the way his mind worked, the way he pieced together details like a puzzle. And right now, Martin could feel the edges of that puzzle beginning to take shape. He needed to fix this. Stepping forward, Martin reached for Daniel's waist, fingers curling around the fabric of his shirt. "I'm sorry," he murmured, pressing a kiss to his jaw. "I should have let you know." Daniel hesitated, just for a second, before leaning into the touch. "Yeah," he said softly. "You should have." Martin closed his eyes, breathing him in, tried to drown in the familiarity of Daniel's scent. But all he could think about was Rolan. Later that night, when Daniel was asleep beside him, Martin lay awake staring at the ceiling. His phone buzzed. His heart slammed against his ribs. Carefully, slowly, he reached for it. A single message. "I still feel you on me." Martin's breath hitched. His fingers hovered over the screen. Then, against every better judgment, he replied, "I can't stop thinking about you." His pulse thundered as he hit send. He turned to look at Daniel, his face peaceful, trusting. Martin hated himself. And yet, he knew, tomorrow night, he would go to Rolan again. The hotel room smelled like skin and sweat, the air thick with something unspoken. The sheets beneath Martin were tangled, evidence of what had happened only moments ago. Rolan lay beside him, one arm draped lazily over his stomach, fingers tracing idle circles against the skin. "You're thinking too much," Rolan murmured. Martin exhaled, staring at the ceiling. His body still hummed from the way Rolan had touched him, claimed him, but his mind was already somewhere else. Back home, where Daniel was probably waiting, unaware of what his husband had just done. "I should go," Martin said, shifting to sit up. Roland's grip tightened, firm but not forceful. "Not yet." Martin swallowed, resisting the pull of it, the weight of Roland's body against his, the heat of him. This was the part he hated the most. The moment after, when reality crept back in. "Daniel's going to start asking questions," Martin muttered, running a hand through his hair. Rolan smirked. "Maybe he already has." Martin's head snapped toward him. "What's that supposed to mean?" Rolan sat up slowly, stretching, his movements unbothered. "He's not an idiot, Martin. You've been distracted, distant." He tilted his head. "Do you really think he hasn't noticed?" Martin clenched his jaw. He hated how easily Rolan could dismantle him with just a few words. "This isn't a game," Martin said, voice quieter now. Rolan studied him, and for the first time, the amusement faded from his eyes. "I never said it was." A silence stretched between them, heavier than before. Martin stood, reaching for his clothes, dressing quickly. He needed to leave, needed to breathe. Rolan didn't stop him. But just as Martin reached the door, Roland's voice cut through the room. "You'll come back." It wasn't a question. Martin didn't answer. He just left. The apartment was dark when Martin stepped inside. For a brief, hopeful moment, he thought Daniel had already gone to bed. But then, from the kitchen, a quiet voice. "You were late again." Martin flinched. He turned, finding Daniel leaning against the counter, arms crossed over his chest. "I told you, work's been—" "Don't," Daniel interrupted, his voice steady but sharp. "Just don't." Martin's stomach twisted. Daniel pushed off the counter, taking slow, measured steps toward him. "Where were you, Martin?" The air between them crackled, thick with something fragile, something on the verge of breaking. Martin opened his mouth, the lie ready, practiced. But something in Daniel's eyes made the words wither before he could escape. Daniel already knew. Martin could see it. The quiet devastation in the way his fingers trembled at his sides, the way his jaw tightened like he was holding himself together by sheer force of will. "Say it," Daniel whispered. Martin's throat closed. He wanted to lie, wanted to salvage what was left. But what was the point? The truth was already there, sitting between them like a living thing. His voice broke. "I'm sorry." Daniel let out a slow, shuddering breath. He turned away, pressing a hand to his forehead. "How long?" Martin's hands clenched into fists. "Daniel." "How long?" Daniel repeated, voice raw now, cracking at the edges. Martin swallowed hard. He couldn't soften this, couldn't dress it up in half-truths. "Months," he admitted. Daniel closed his eyes. His shoulders shook, just barely, before he steadied himself. When he turned back around, his expression was unreadable. "I see." Silence wrapped around them, suffocating. Martin stepped forward. "Daniel, don't." Daniel held up a hand. "Just don't." The distance between them had never felt so vast. Martin had feared this moment for weeks, had tried to outrun it, but now that it was here, he realized something terrifying. Losing Daniel felt worse than any guilt ever had. Daniel's voice was quiet when he finally spoke again. "I think you should leave." Martin's heart dropped. "Daniel." "Please," Daniel whispered. His eyes were glassy, but he refused to let the tears fall. "Just go." Martin's breath shuddered. He wanted to fight, wanted to beg, but he didn't deserve that. So he left, and as the door closed behind him, he knew there was no coming back from this. The apartment felt different now. Martin stood in the doorway, a bag slung over his shoulder, staring at the space that had been home for years. The air inside was still, heavy with something unspoken. Daniel wasn't in sight, but Martin knew he was there, somewhere just beyond the kitchen, maybe in the bedroom they had once shared. A part of him wanted to call out, to say something, anything. But what was left to say? He had broken them. And now he was the one walking away. Slowly. He set his keys on the small table by the door, the sound barely a whisper against the silence. He didn't need them anymore. Roland's place was the opposite of Daniel's. Sleek, minimal, like it belonged to someone who never planned on staying too long. Martin sat on the edge of the bed, the sheets cool beneath his fingertips. It had been 2 days since Daniel told him to leave. 2 days of waiting for some kind of clarity, some sign that he had made the right choice, or at least the only choice he had left. Rolan emerged from the bathroom, towel slung low on his hips, water dripping from his hair. "You're still thinking too much," he said, the same words he had murmured before. But this time they held something different, an edge of frustration. Martin didn't respond. Rolan sighed, stepping closer, tilting Martin's chin up with 2 fingers. "You got what you wanted," he said, searching his face. "Didn't you?" Martin's stomach twisted. Had he? Had this ever been what he wanted? Or had it just been an escape, a reckless, selfish hunger that had devoured everything in its path? Rolan leaned in, lips brushing against Martin's jaw. "You're mine now." Martin's eyes fluttered shut, but all he saw was Daniel. The way his face had crumpled that night, the way his voice had broken when he told him to leave. Martin pulled away. "I need some air." Rolan frowned but didn't stop him. "Suit yourself." Martin grabbed his jacket and stepped outside. The city stretched around him, endless and indifferent, and for the first time in weeks, Martin felt it, the emptiness. He didn't know where he was going until he was already there. Daniel's apartment. Or maybe it wasn't his anymore. Maybe it never would be again. He stood outside the building, staring up at the window that had once been theirs. The lights inside were off. Daniel was home, but he was in the dark. Martin's chest ached. He pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen. He could text, could call, could say something. But what could he possibly say that would make any of this right? A part of him wanted to knock on the door, to beg. But hadn't he already done enough? Slowly, Martin lowered his phone. And then, for the first time since this all began, he turned around and walked away.